This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so get this picture. World War II, it's just ended, and the world's trying to, pick up the pieces, and make sure another Great Depression doesn't happen.
Yeah, trying to avoid the mistakes of the past, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in the middle of all this, what do? 44 nations decide to meet up in this tiny town?
Yeah, out of all places, right?
In New Hampshire.
Bretton Woods.
Bretton Woods, seriously.
It doesn't exactly scream global economic power center, does it?
No, not really. So what went down in this little town that's so important?
Well, they basically hashed out the plans that became the foundation for the entire modern global financial system.
That's insane. One conference set the stage for decades of economic activity.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
We're talking about the birth of institutions we hear about all the time, but probably don't really understand, like the IMF, the World Bank.
Yeah, those are just a couple of the big names that came out of Bretton Woods.
So paint a picture for us. It's 1944. The world is recovering from a devastating war.
Things are chaotic, currencies are fluctuating, nobody trusts each other.
Yeah, and international trade is a mess.
Bretton Woods was an attempt to bring some order to all that madness.
Okay, so these delegates, they're sitting in this room feeling the weight of history on their shoulders.
No pressure, right?
What exactly were they hoping to achieve?
Well, they had three main goals.
All right, lay it on us.
First, stabilize exchange rates.
Okay, makes sense, because before Bretton Woods, currencies were all over the place, right?
Exactly. Countries were constantly devaluing their currencies, trying to gain an advantage in trade.
It was like a constant game of financial hot potato.
Exactly, and it was hurting everybody.
Yeah, imagine you're trying to run a business importing goods.
One day they cost this much, the next day something totally different.
Impossible to plan.
So they came up with this system of fixed exchange rates.
So currencies were pegged to something stable.
Yeah, they pegged them to the US dollar, which at the time was backed by gold.
Ah, so that's where the stability came from.
Yep, that brought predictability to global markets.
All right, so that's goal number one, stabilize the chaos.
What's goal number two?
Let me guess, prevent countries from messing with their currencies, just to get ahead.
You got it. They wanted to prevent those competitive devaluations we were just talking about.
Yeah, those sneaky tactics.
Exactly. They set rules to discourage countries from manipulating their currencies for a quick trade advantage.
So cooperation, not cutthroat competition.
Exactly.
Okay, that's two goals down. What's the
The
third?
big one, promoting global growth.
Okay, yeah, after a war, you got to rebuild everything, right?
Exactly. They knew that rebuilding a war-torn world would require a massive effort and cooperation.
So by stabilizing currencies and encouraging trade, they could boost economies worldwide.
Yep, especially in war-ravaged Europe.
So it wasn't just about preventing bad things, it was about actively building a better future.
That was the whole idea.
And this is where the IMF and the World Bank come in, right?
Bingo. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, acts as kind of a global financial referee.
A referee. Okay, I like that.
They monitor exchange rates, provide loans to countries that are in trouble, and try to prevent financial meltdowns.
So keeping the game fair.
Precisely.
And what about the World Bank? What's their role in all of this?
Think of them as the coach.
The coach. Okay, I'm following you.
They focus on development.
Development.
Yeah, originally it was all about rebuilding Europe, but now it's more about helping developing nations grow their economies.
Through loans and expertise, I'm guessing.
Exactly.
So these two massive institutions, born in a tiny New Hampshire town, tasked with nothing less than fixing the world's economy.
Quite the responsibility, huh?
No kidding. And they had a secret weapon,
Oh, yeah, what's that?
the U.S. dollar.
Ah, yes, the mighty dollar.
It became the world's reserve currency, meaning central banks around the globe held onto it like it was gold.
Well, it actually was linked to gold at the time.
Right, I forgot about that.
Yeah.
So why is that such a big deal? What does it even mean to be a reserve currency?
Think of it as the preferred language of global trade.
Okay, so everybody needs to speak it.
Exactly. Since everyone was holding dollars, it made international transactions smoother.
And it gave the U.S. a lot of influence.
You could say that.
So did the U.S. plan this all along? Did they go into Bretton Woods thinking, let's make the dollar king?
That's a good question, and the answer might surprise you.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they actually expected the Soviet Union to join the party.
Wait, seriously? The Soviets, they thought they could get the Soviets on board with this whole capitalist-led economic system.
They did. And they were pretty shocked when the Soviets said, yet.
I bet. They really thought they could create a truly global system, even with the Cold War tensions brewing.
It seems naive in hindsight, right?
Yeah, a little bit. So this wasn't just an economic snub. It was like a symbolic rejection of the whole Western economic order.
Exactly. It solidified the economic and ideological divide between the East and the West.
Wow, talk about awkward. So even as they were trying to rebuild the world together,
The seeds of future conflict were already being sown.
it makes you wonder what might have happened if things had gone differently.
It's one of those what-ifs of history.
A lot to think about already. I think our listeners need a minute to process all this before we dive deeper into the consequences of these decisions made at Bretton Woods.
Yeah, good idea. Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to our deep dive into Bretton Woods.
So last time we were talking about the US dollar and how it became the world's reserve currency.
Yeah, it seemed like a pretty sweet deal for the U.S.
Totally, but like with anything, there's got to be a downside, right? It can't all be sunshine and roses for the American dollar.
Well, you're right about that. Being at the top comes with its own set of challenges.
Okay, spill the tea. What went wrong?
Well, by the late 1960s, the Bretton Woods system was starting to show some cracks.
Cracks? Like what?
Remember how the dollar was pegged to gold?
Yeah, that was like the whole foundation of the system.
Exactly. Well, the U.S. was running a growing trade deficit, meaning they were importing more than they were exporting.
So more dollars were flowing out of the U.S. than coming in?
Precisely. And since foreign countries could exchange those dollars for gold, U.S. gold reserves started to shrink.
Uh-oh. It's like a bank run, but on a global scale.
A pretty good analogy.
And to make matters worse, inflation was on the rise in the U.S.
Not a good situation. So you've got a shrinking gold supply, more dollars floating around, and prices going up.
That's a recipe for disaster.
You said it. Countries started to lose faith in the dollar's gold backing.
They were probably thinking, can the U.S. really keep this promise to convert all these dollars into gold?
Exactly. The pressure was mounting.
So what happened? Did everyone just dump their dollars and go for the gold?
Pretty much. The pressure became too much to handle. In 1971, President Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard.
Wow, talk about a drastic move.
It was a huge decision. It basically ended the fixed exchange rate system that Bretton Woods was built on.
What happened to the global economy? Did it just collapse?
Well, there was definitely a period of adjustment. Currencies started to float freely against each other.
So more volatility?
Yeah, but also more flexibility.
I guess there are two sides to every coin. But what about those institutions we talked about earlier, the IMF and the World Bank?
Yes. They had to adapt to this new, more complex financial world.
Because they're still around today, right?
Absolutely. And the challenges they face now are way different from what they were dealing with in the post-war era.
So even though the Bretton Woods system itself is gone, its legacy lives on in these institutions.
Exactly. They've evolved over time, but their core principles are still there.
Which
We're
are?
promoting international cooperation, financial stability, and economic development.
So how do historians view this whole Bretton Woods saga?
Well, like with anything historical, there are multiple perspectives.
Give us the rundown.
Some historians take the orthodox view. They see Bretton Woods as a necessary response to the economic chaos of the interwar period.
So they're basically saying Bretton Woods saved the world from another Great Depression.
That's their take. But then you have the revisionist historians.
Okay. And what do they think?
They're a bit more critical. They argue that Bretton Woods was more about cementing U.S. dominance than fostering genuine global cooperation.
Interesting. So it was all a power play by the U.S.
That's what they suggest. They point to how much the U.S. benefited from the dollar becoming the world's reserve currency.
It definitely gave them a lot of economic and political power.
No doubt about it.
So we've got one side saying it was an act of global leadership and the other side saying it was all about U.S. self-interest.
Yeah, it's a classic debate in historical circles.
What about the whole Cold War angle? We talked about how the Soviets rejected Bretton Woods.
Right, well, there's the Cold War perspective, which focuses on the ideological struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
So those historians see Bretton Woods as a key moment in the deepening divide between the capitalist West and the communist East.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how the same event can be interpreted in such different ways.
That's the beauty of history. There's rarely one right answer.
It's all about perspective, right?
Exactly. In recent years, there's been a shift towards a more balanced view of Bretton Woods.
So acknowledging both the good and the bad.
Precisely. It's about recognizing the complexity. It wasn't all good, it wasn't all bad. There were wins and losses, intended and unintended consequences.
It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, things don't always go as planned.
You got it. But by studying the past, we can learn from both our successes and our mistakes.
So how does all this Bretton Woods history affect our listeners today?
Yeah.
I mean, the system itself collapsed decades ago.
That's a great question. Even though the formal system is gone, its echoes are still felt today.
How so?
Well, those institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, they're still major players in the global economy.
Right. They're the ones responding to financial crises, providing loans, and working on development projects.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the US dollar. It's still the top dog in the world of reserve currencies.
So that power dynamic we talked about,
Yeah.
it's still in play.
To some extent, yes. But things are changing. The rise of other economic powers like China is challenging the dollar's dominance.
Things are getting even more complex.
That's the nature of the global economy. But understanding the history of Bretton Woods gives us a framework for understanding how we got here.
And what challenges we might face in the future.
Exactly.
So this whole Bretton Woods thing is about way more than just some technical financial stuff.
You're absolutely right. It's a reminder that economic decisions can have huge geopolitical consequences.
I'm ready to go even deeper.
Yeah.
What else should our listeners know about the long-term impacts of Bretton Woods? And are there any other alternative perspectives we should consider? All right, so we're back, and we've been talking about this whole Bretton Woods thing and how it kind of reshaped the world.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild story when you think about it. This conference in a tiny town in New Hampshire had such a massive impact on the global economy and even geopolitics.
Totally. But before we wrap things up, I think it's important to remember that there's always more than one side to the story, right?
Absolutely. We've talked about the orthodox and revisionist views, but there are other perspectives on Bretton Woods that challenge the traditional narrative even more.
Oh, really? Like,
Well, for starters, some critics argue that Bretton Woods, even with its goal of promoting global development, might have actually reinforced existing inequalities between rich and poor countries.
so they were trying to help rebuild the world, but they might have unintentionally made the gap between the haves and have-nots even bigger.
That's the argument. You have to remember that Bretton Woods was designed in a world where colonialism was still a thing.
Oh, right. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, so many newly independent nations were struggling to find their footing in a global economy that was already tilted in favor of the developed world.
And on top of that, the IMF and World Bank often attach some pretty tough conditions to their loans.
Exactly. Those conditions sometimes forced countries to adopt policies that benefited the lenders more than the borrowers.
That doesn't seem very fair.
It's a valid criticism. And this critique has gotten even louder in recent years with globalization and inequality becoming such huge issues.
So while Bretton Woods was supposed to create a more stable and prosperous world, it maybe didn't do enough to ensure global equity?
It's a good point. Good intentions don't always translate into equitable outcomes, right?
Right. And it shows us that we need to constantly reassess and reform global institutions to make sure they're really working for everyone, not just the wealthy countries.
Exactly. It's about making sure everyone has a seat at the table.
I like that.
Yeah.
So are there any other alternative perspectives we should consider?
Yeah, there's also a school of thought that says that the legacy of Bretton Woods is more complex than just a success or failure.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about it. The fixed exchange rate system eventually collapsed, but the institutions created at Bretton Woods, the IMF and World Bank, they're still around today.
And they've been pretty important in handling global financial crises.
Exactly. And they continue to support development projects and encourage cooperation between nations.
So maybe Bretton Woods wasn't perfect, but it did lay the groundwork for decades of economic growth and globalization.
That's one way to look at it. It's a complicated story with both positive and negative aspects, and its legacy continues to shape our world today.
It seems like the real takeaway here is that history is never truly over. It's always influencing the present and the future.
Well said. And as we deal with all the challenges of the 21st century, it's more important than ever to learn from the past.
To learn from both the good and the bad.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Bretton Woods, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest one is that international cooperation is essential. Bretton Woods showed us that global problems need global solutions.
And we need to be mindful of those power dynamics we talked about, making sure that everyone has a voice and that the benefits of global cooperation are shared fairly.
Absolutely. Another lesson is that economic systems have to be flexible. The world is constantly changing, and our institutions need to adapt.
The only constant is change, right?
Exactly. And lastly, I hope our listeners come away with a better understanding of how history shapes the present and how we can use that knowledge to create a better future.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Bretton Woods. It's been a fascinating journey through history, economics, and the power of human collaboration.
And a reminder that even those seemingly boring financial arrangements can have a huge impact on all of our lives.
Well said. Until next time, keep diving deeper.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.